It's a pleasure for me to be with you. Miles and Sarah are very close friends, and two of the most sort of inspiring, one of the most inspiring couples we know. My wife and I always look at how the Lord has used them down through the decades and the years, and their determination to keep God at the center, whether things are going well or whether they're hard, and it's just been amazing to have that friendship. I don't always think positively of Miles. He has 4 degrees. I think you can technically say he has 4 degrees from the University of Oxford, which to me just sounds a little bit greedy. Do you know what I mean? You know, 1's okay, 2's understandable, some people have 3, but once you start getting 4, then that's just, you know, cause for concern. We're going to be looking briefly. We'll take about half an hour, because I'd really love to be able to give time to have some Q&A. And depending on how the questions go and so on, I may call on my colleague Sanj just to deal with some of them. But when we look at this subject of money, happiness, love, when we're looking at these 3 things, what we're often doing is we're looking ultimately for the right thing, but sometimes in the wrong place. And the trouble is if you're looking for the right thing, but in the wrong place, you're never going to find it. As a matter of fact, the worst thing can happen, which is you find the thing you thought you needed, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not what you were looking for at all. So there are some very interesting questions and issues. One of the interesting things about the person of Jesus Christ, however, is he never questions our desire for fulfillment. What he constantly questions is ultimately where it's going to be found. How will that play out in our life? Now, there's the Cicelli Professor of Economic History at the University of Oxford, who I sometimes quote, because I like saying Cicelli Professor of Economic History, because it sounds like something amazing is about to happen. He points out in one of his books that the challenge of affluence is that the flow of reward into our life undermines our capacity to enjoy it. Let me say that again. The flow of reward into our life can undermine our capacity to enjoy it. Now that, if you think about it, is an amazing thing. What does that mean? It means when you anticipate getting the latest iPhone or whatever it is, Huawei, there's more joy in that. Does that make sense? In the 3 months thinking, I'm going to get it, I'm going to get it, I'm going to get it. When you get it, the depreciation curve in economic terms is very steep. Okay? Within a week, you're already wondering what comes next. So one of the things that we try to fill our life with is novelty. Okay? In other words, the new will somehow enthrall us. But again, to put it in the terms of economics, novelty depreciates at a very steep rate. Because by definition, something isn't new when you've had it for a while. So we often find ourselves in life running on what we could call a hedonic treadmill. Now, there's some very fascinating research that's been done that I'll briefly share with you, and then I want to just turn to the scriptures, because Jesus Christ is well ahead of the curve as normal when it comes to these things. But when I did some study in economics, I was taught about the rational consumer. And the rational consumer was famously defined by a very famous economist, by Milton Friedman, as someone, okay, the rational consumer always makes rational choices, and they're aware of all of their motives, all of the options, all of the consequences of those options, and what their own good is. Now just think about that. To be aware of all of your motives, all of your options, all of the consequences to those options, and what your own good is. Now, that's why most modern economists would say the rational consumer is a myth. Okay, this person just doesn't exist. Even when it talks about what is good for us, it's hard to define. Very often in political speech, when people run for office, they give speeches and they say things like, our country is sick, vote for us, we'll make it better. And they use a medical analogy. Now, there's a problem with that analogy that G.K. Chesterton very famously picked up on. He said there's a big difference between medical science and our political and economic science. In medical science, the doctors often disagree about what is making you ill. Does that make sense? So you go to one doctor, he says it's this problem. You go to another doctor, it's this problem. They disagree about the illness. But the one thing doctors all agree on is what a healthy body looks like. So the doctor may send you home from the hospital by necessity with one leg less. They will never, ever send you back from the hospital with one leg more. In other words, the doctors agree on the good. This is what a healthy body looks like. They disagree about the bad. But in political science, in economic science, we seem very happy to agree on the bad. Something is wrong. What we disagree on is what the solution should look like. And the solution that one person proposes to another person is worse than the problem it seeks to solve. And this is very often why we tear our eyes out, each other's eyes out, in politics. It's not that we can't agree that something's wrong. The fundamental problem is we can't agree what is right. What does it mean to have the good life? What does it mean to be fulfilled? What does it mean to actually be complete, whole? Now, Jesus Christ answered this question directly. He was asked the question and he answered it. The question that he gets asked comes up in Luke chapter 12. And in Luke chapter 12, verse 13, it says, "Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.'" Now, this is an amazing question. And I'm preaching from Miles Tallman's Bible because it's more anointed than mine. The guy comes and he says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." I'm not going to go into all of this right now. This is a cry for economic justice. Okay, the question is obviously coming from a younger brother. His problem is that the older brother, according to the custom, has inherited the bulk of the estate. And I would like to say, as an older brother myself, I believe this is a very reasonable and godly thing to happen. So the younger brother comes and he says, "Look, you tell my brother to give me my share." This is a cry for justice. Now, I don't know if you were here for the morning, but here's the problem. Very often, we disguise the longings of our heart and we convert them into cries for justice. The trouble is, most of our pursuit of justice is no longer informed by the pursuit of love. Think about it globally. How many causes for justice around the world right now, whether it's framed in terms of politics, economics, or land, how many of those political disputes are motivated by a love of justice to do the right thing, and how many are driven by hatred and anger? When you pursue justice through disappointment or anger, it doesn't work even if you get what you wanted. That's why in Hosea chapter 5, verse 7, it says, "You have turned justice into bitterness, and as a result, all of your righteous fruit tastes like poison." It's a very powerful image. When justice it becomes bitter, the fruit it produces is actually poisonous. So someone comes to Jesus with a economic cry for justice. Okay, give me this money. Now, there's an assumption which the young guy is making, and it's very simple. If I get what I want, then my life will be complete. And so often in the field of money, love, we assume that we get the combination right, happiness is the result. Does that make sense? We're looking for a combination that somehow makes us complete. What Jesus Christ does in his answer is amazing. Jesus looks at the guy and says, "Man, who made me a judge between you?" Now, he's actually quoting from the Old Testament. This is the same question that comes up in the life of Moses, and I won't go into all of that, but it's quite abrupt. Jesus takes them back to a point of authority, and he says to the guy asking the question, "You've asked me a question. Who has given me this authority?" Jesus says. Have you given it to me? In which case, will you listen to what I have to say? Has God given it to me? In which case, will you listen to what I have to say? The guy has to ask the question first. You know, it's very easy to give advice that isn't wanted. The next time someone asks you for advice, you better ask them if they really actually want to hear what you have to say. Jesus is taking them back to a point of authority. Then Jesus says, "Take heed and beware of greed." Now that warning To beware of greed is fascinating. It's very hard to resist something you cannot see. One person put it like this. They said, it's hard to see the wall of your prison when the cell is made of glass. It's hard to see the wall of your prison when the cell is made of glass. Sometimes we can live in effect in a glass prison because we can see through the wall, we think we're free, but actually we're trapped within it. Jesus says, beware of greed. Now, why does the New Testament warn against greed more than any other sin? Because it does. Have you ever wondered that? And the answer is, we don't see it. The walls of greed we do not see. It's not like adultery. Okay? No one commits adultery and then looks at the woman lying next to them and goes, "Oh, you're not my wife." Okay? You can see it. I mean, it's pretty obvious. But when is the last time in a Bible group someone came to you and said, my sin is greed? You see, we can see lust. We can see all these other things. But to see greed, to recognize it, is very hard. The Greek word here is fascinating. If you have a King James translation, it will say, take heed of covetousness. The Greek word is a compound word. It means beware of desires that cannot easily be satisfied. Some desires, no matter how much you feed them, are never fully satisfied. And Jesus says you need to beware of unsatiable desires. Desires which no matter how much you feed it, it will never be enough. And then Jesus goes on to say something. He says, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And he said, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones, and there I'll store all my grain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of goods laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, there's a play of words in this text, which we don't always get in the translation, because it's really fascinating. Let me start off by asking you a question. Is it right to be merry or not? Now, there's an interesting question. I actually once asked this question in Oxford at a theological training institution to a group of people who've been ordained, and I said, I have a question for you. Is it right to desire your own happiness? And there was silence in the room. That tells you something. 3 years of theological education, they still don't know if they're meant to be happy or not. Now, we hear that word merry, and we interpret it negatively. Does that make sense? It's the context which decides its use. This is the same word in Greek that is used by the father in the prodigal son, when the father said, but we had to celebrate, we had to make merry, for this son was lost and is found. He was dead and is now alive. So this word itself is neutral. Does that make sense? It's not speaking against the idea of merriment. What gives it its moral context is the context the word itself is used in, but the word itself can go either way. So the Gospel of Luke uses it positively and negatively. So let's just back up and see what's being said here. Jesus said there was a guy who had a reasonably sized business, and then the dream came that every businessman hopes for. He has 1 year in which the return on his investment is so enormous he can retire. The Greek word, a man's forth brought forth many crops. The Greek word there is from phros. It comes from Euphrain. It means to produce. Okay, to produce like a fruit, to return. And in Greek, if you take any Greek word and you put the letters EU in front of it, it makes it bigger. So I'm not talking about Brexit and the EU in it, although the EU, well, it's currently getting smaller, but up until now it's been getting bigger and bigger. But when you put EU in front of a word, it expands it. It makes it bigger. So he takes the word to bring forth, and they put EU in front of it. Does that make sense? In other words, this was a bumper return. This was something more than could normally be expected. So now the guy's primary problem is wealth management, not wealth creation. So how does he store it and then use it so it can be enjoyed over a long period of time? And he says to himself, Jesus said, you have many things laid up for many years. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones, and I'll say to myself, eat, drink, and be merry. Now that word merry is fascinating. It comes from the second part of the word is the word throne. It means the diaphragm. The first part of the word is the letters EU, U. What do those words do? Well, they make the next word bigger. How do you expand the diaphragm? Are there any singers here? There must be at least one person who sings in a choir or something. How do you expand the diaphragm? Yeah, you. Okay? So the word euthrone literally is to. That's what's meant by that word. That deep inhalation of satisfaction. Does that make sense? I can finally say, it's okay. That's what the Father said in Luke 15. We had to euthrone. We literally had to be big diaphragm people. Okay? This is a moment where you go, oh, this is wonderful. So you see the logic. From the euphros, from the abundance of things, comes the euthrone, this abundance in life. And God looks at him and says, you fool. Now, the normal Greek word for fool is the Greek word moron. We translate it into the English word moron. It means to be a moron, to be stupid. That is the word which is used to be foolish in most of the Bible. This is a unique exception. This is not the word used here. The word used here is athrone. Now the throne is the diaphragm. When you put the Greek A, the Greek alpha in front of any word, it negates what comes after it. You see what God is saying? You who from the euphros, the abundance of things, comes this euthrone, this deep satisfaction in life, you will end up athrone. You will end up with the opposite of what you hoped you would get. So it's a very powerful image. It's challenging the idea that once we have enough, everything else automatically is the case. Now, notice something here. This is not talking about making money. This is not talking about how you store money. This is talking about whether you believe it's going to be enough to deliver everything else you need in your life. The Christian view of money is actually very positive. We're told to steward and to give. They're two different things. Give means you give up control. When you've given your money, it's gone. Okay? You have no control. Steward implies control. So when you have stewardship over something, you have control and your job is to multiply it. The Bible talks about both. So the Bible has no problem with the making of money, the generation of money, how we store money, or how we use money. The question is, what do we think it can deliver in our hearts? And the answer is, if we put our trust there, it's never going to be enough. Now, the Bible teaches a similar parallel also when it comes to human relationship. One of the reasons I love the Anglican Church is, I don't know what happens in this church, but if you read the wedding vows in the Anglican Church, they're actually very profound. If you look at the wedding vows all through history, they're very profound. Now, today, we often have this thing where people write their own wedding vows. Now, there may be people here who wrote their own wedding vows, so don't take this overly personally. But I find it interesting when I'm at a wedding and they've written their wedding vows and one person looks at the other and they say, you're my all in all. You make me complete. You make me whole. Without you, I would have no reason to live. The interesting thing is, historically, the church would have seen those statements as potentially blasphemous. Because the only person those words you can speak to is God. God can complete you. God makes you whole. Without him, there is no reason to live. With him, you have every reason to live. If you put that trust in another person, you're trying to make that person God to your heart. And now you've not simply created an idol, you've created an idol that will fail. They will disappoint you. They cannot fulfill that role. It's impossible. So you're setting yourself up for failure even before you've started. In the context of marriage, we find the fulfillment of love from him. Does that make sense? His love is shed abroad in our hearts by the power of his Spirit, and from us it overflows to other people. Now there's a completeness there. So the Bible has these two parallels with both of them. Now, here's then what I find really interesting. As you go through this thing, after God says, "You fool," he says, "This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get everything you prepared for yourself?" It's very difficult to truly live in light of eternity. We look and we're pursuing things that we hope will fulfill us. What we often mistake in our life is we think we live in the hope of unrealized dreams. So that most of us think, look, once I finally get to that level, then everything else by comparison makes sense. Now, let me just try and unpack this a little bit, because hopefully this will become key. The research I referred to earlier, the economists have been doing, what they basically say is this: the way most of us live our life is we want something, we live in desire of it, and when we experience it, it goes up here. We're excited. Then we experience a drop in satisfaction. Okay? Then we repeat the pattern of behavior. Okay? So you buy the next phone. The trouble is, the next high is lower than the first high. And then you go down again. And the second low is lower than the first low. So then you repeat the pattern of behavior again through your consumption. So now you do it a third time and a fourth time. Each time, the high gets lower. Does that make sense? And the low gets lower. So the overall curve goes down like that. What that means then is if you want to get the same level of satisfaction in life, you can't repeat the first behavior. You have to do something which is more extreme to get the same level of satisfaction. And then you have to do it a third time, even more extreme, to get the same kind of hit. If you talk to anyone who's got caught up in pornography, they'll describe that cycle for you. The first thing that thrilled them wasn't enough the second time. It had to be a bit more extreme, and then a bit more extreme, and then a bit more extreme. You're pursuing an increasing level of extremity, and you're making the treadmill go faster and faster and faster to get the same level of satisfaction. What Jesus is trying to speak to in Luke 12 is he's, in one sense, rephrasing what you read in Isaiah 55. In Isaiah 55, it says, "Come to me. Why spend your money on what doesn't satisfy? Why spend your labor on that which isn't gold? Come to me, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare." You may have heard this sometimes quoted at Christmas time or something like that. Again, it's the same parallel structure. God isn't questioning our desire for happiness. He's saying, look, you're spending your time, your energy on all of these things, but they don't satisfy you. You're spending your money on things which don't deliver in your life. Why do that? Why keep doing something which cannot meet the desire of your heart, even if you've got more than enough of it? And then God doesn't say the solution to this is to give up this desire for fulfillment, give up the desire for happiness in your life. That's not what he says. Rather, he says, you will find that desire met when you fully meet me, when you fully come to me. One of the challenges that we have in this world is that the more money we have, or the more power that we have, or the more popular that we are, or the more beautiful that we are, we tend to rely on ourselves and use God when we get stuck. Whereas what God wants us to do is to learn to rely on him and allow him to use us for his purpose. And this then has to then be the ultimate thing that Jesus Christ is actually teaching here. What he's saying to every single one of us is, look, if you're trying to rely on these things to bring fulfillment into your life, it's going to be bankrupt. It doesn't matter, and you'll never hit that level. And even if you one day do think you've made it, at that point, there's going to come a time when God will ask you to give an account of yourself, and it won't be yours anyway. You need to find a way to live on this differently. The euphrone, the satisfaction in life, doesn't come from the euphros, the abundance of possessions. That's going to lead you to affluence. You're going to have to find a different thing, and it's actually found in the pursuit of God and the person of himself. Now, let me give just one last thought, and then I want to open this up for questions. What does this mean, therefore, for a theology of work? Now, I don't know if you've often thought about it. Why do we work? It's a very interesting question. I have a feeling if you ask the average Malaysian, why do you work? They will say something like, well, I need a house, I need clothing, I've got, 4 kids, and now they've opened Starbucks in Malaysia, I feel permanently impoverished. Okay, so that's why we need to work. Okay? We work for food, clothing, and shelter. Do you remember that Jesus Christ got asked that question? Any of you remember that? Jesus said, do not worry about what you will wear or about where you will sleep, for the pagans run after these things. So Jesus says the pagan answer as to why do we work is to get food, clothing, and shelter. Now that's very interesting. When most Christians give the non-Christian answer to a very basic question, it tells you that something's gone wrong up here. Now, Jesus' answer should make us all panic. Jesus said, do not worry about all of these things. Okay? This is what the pagans run after. Does that mean he wants us to be naked and homeless? What Jesus says next is one of the most quoted verses in the Bible, but never in context. Because the context Jesus is speaking to is about money, work, and why we do it. Can anyone remember what Jesus says next? Go on, someone's repeating it, I can hear it. But seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. What's Jesus Christ saying? Jesus is saying that the purpose of work isn't to get food, clothing, and shelter. That's the byproduct of work. Jesus said, you seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. The reason why God has put a calling on your life and sets you to work is that is where you're going to learn about his rule and his reign. He's put you in a place where you can seek him first. And if you seek him first, in where he's placed you to work, all these other things, food, clothing, shelter, are added to you. That's the way he's designed it. In other words, the goal of work for the Christian is something much greater than the byproducts of it. And if you get the goal and the byproducts confused, very often you take shortcuts in your life to get the byproduct and you forget about the goal altogether. This is also what Jesus is trying to teach us in Luke 12. He's saying the same thing but in a different way. He's not against any of these things. The question is, what can it actually bring into your heart and your life? Wherever he has placed you, you seek him first. And then when you've sought him first, then you ask yourself, what do I do with the byproducts? I'm going to say one last thing and then we're going to into Q&A. And I haven't been asked to say this, by the way, just in case you're wondering. It's possible, actually, maybe at one point Miles has shared this with you, because I remember sharing, this had a huge impact on me when I first heard it. The reason why it's very important to understand about the goal and the byproduct is it totally changes the way you even think about money. I have the privilege of working with a guy called John Bechtel. He is in his late 70s, coming up for 80. He can speak fluent Cantonese and he's pretty good in Mandarin. But he's a big, heavy American guy. I like him because when I stand next to him, he makes me look like an athlete. But John's family was the last family to be forcibly expelled from China. One of the last foreign missionaries. They burnt his father's library in public, all of his books, and they went to Hong Kong. While John was in Hong Kong at a young age, he noticed all these kids on the street. And I won't even attempt to give you the Cantonese name. I think it's like the Sundo Camp, but I'm probably not even saying that right. I probably said something potentially very rude, I don't know. But John saw all these kids and he began to ask himself the question, we need to do something to help all of these kids. Well, he wanted to set up a camp to do summer camps for the kids. And he found 3 different sites to hold camps. And every time he couldn't raise the money. The 3rd site he found was perfect. It was a school, it had all of these sporting facilities, it was everything you would want a camp to be. And about that time, a guy called Billy Graham, you may have heard of him, came to Hong Kong. And he had a guy traveling with him, an American businessman called Walter Maloon. Walter went on a tour of Hong Kong with John Bechtel. John Bechtel shared the vision for the camp and what he wanted to do. And at the end of it, this guy Walter said, John, that's the most amazing vision. I will help you secure the vision. I'm going to go back to America and raise all the money that you need. Well, 3 months later, John Bechtel got a letter through the post. It said, Dear John, I have some bad news for you. Things haven't gone as well as I hoped. I've only received one donation for you to buy the camp. And I enclose it with my letter. And in the letter, there's a second envelope addressed to him. He opens it, and there's a letter in there from a 12-year-old girl. It said, Dear Mr. Bechtel, I've heard about your vision and what you want to do in Hong Kong. As I prayed about it, I felt I wanted to send you my pocket money that's been given to me this month to buy ice cream. I enclose it with my letter. With much love, Belinda Holmes. And with the letter, there was a $1 note. And then after she signed her names, she said, please use my letter and money to buy the camp. Well, John was so upset with this letter, he almost put it in the bin. But his wife said to him, John, I think you need to do what this girl has asked you. You should use her money and her letter to buy the camp, the school. So he went to the school and he found the caretaker and he said to the caretaker, I wish to make an offer to buy the building. And the caretaker said, what is it? And he handed over the letter. The guy read the letter and saw the dollar bill and said, is that a joke? And John said no, and the guy threw the letter back at him. John then got very legal on him and said, if you don't pass on my offer to the board, I'll report you to the government, because by law you have to pass on every offer. So the caretaker said, fine. Well, here's the amazing thing. The board that owned that property read the letter, and they were so moved by what they read, they agreed to sell him that site for $1. Now, if John Bechtel was speaking to you at this point, he'll put a picture behind him. Last time I saw that picture, it was on a screen about 3 times the size of this. It's an aerial photograph of the largest stadium in Hong Kong. It was taken 6 years ago. They had a reunion for everyone who gave their life to Christ in that camp. There were 80,000 people there. 20 years later, John Bechtel was telling this story in a church. And after he'd finished telling this story, a woman in her 30s came up to him and said, Mr. Bechtel, my name is Belinda Holmes. And 20 years ago, I was that 12-year-old girl who sent you that $1. Well, John made the elders of the church go outside and bring everyone who hadn't left back into the building. And he introduced them to the woman he'd been talking about in his sermon. He suggested they take a collection to send her back to Hong Kong so she could see what her gift had done. Well, apparently they raised enough money to send her, her family, and half the British Army back to Hong Kong. $1. She gave what she had. She put it into the hands of Christ, and it's had the most incredible return for the kingdom. When we get the goal of work and the byproducts of work confused, we miss out on so much what God has for us. God doesn't challenge us about how we think about how love and money operate in our life at a human level because he wants to take something away from us. It's because there's so much more he has for us. So what is it that he's speaking to you about? What is the reason why you work? What is the purpose of it? And is it possible that we're looking to find satisfaction in something that was never designed to fully fulfill our heart? That's what Christ has for us. Okay, that's enough rambling from me up front about this. So hopefully at least 1 or 2 things have been said that make sense. If the person next to you has fallen asleep, now is the time to wake them up. And you may rebuke them for eating too much rice. We're going to have a time of Q&A. I don't know how Miles wants to. I think Miles has got a thing. There are 2 microphones at the back. You can ask me any question you want. Anything about what I've said, something I haven't said. Do I moisturize? Any question you feel you want to ask me, utterly okay. And then we'll run with that until about 3 o'clock. Does anyone have a question at this stage?
Hi, Michael. First of all, thank you so much for your sermon in the morning. It was incredibly moving, and I think it gives us a lot to think about love. But for now, I have two questions. I think this is leaning towards the apologetics side of things. The first question is, if God is all-knowing, meaning that he knows past, present, and future, and he's omnipotent, so he knew that Jesus was going to die and rise again. So what is it that he actually loses when he knew that he was going to get Jesus back?
Okay, did you all hear the question? The question was, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, sees everything, and he knew that Jesus was going to die and come back to life, what does he lose when he actually dies?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes, yes.
That's a really good question. Okay, who wants to ask a different question? Okay, now. Look, the question is brilliant. Let's make the question harder. During the time of Emperor Nero, it was reported that when Christians were fed to be eaten by lions, that those that were found that still had faces were smiling. So here's the question. When Jesus was crucified, just before he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating blood and tears, Father, if it's possible, take this cup from me. A few decades later, Christians are being fed alive as martyrs to the lions, and they die with smiles on their faces. Does that mean they were braver than Jesus? Or maybe there was something wrong with the Christians. They were like mentally, they wanted the pain. And so they're in the arena, they're looking at the lions, and they're going, ooh, lions! I've always wanted to be eaten alive by a lion. God, thank you for answering this prayer. So why were they happy? Now, this raises a really important question. And it lies in the other part of your question. If Jesus knew he was going to be raised to life again, what's the big deal with dying? Look, if you knew for sure I had the power to resurrect you, to bring you back to life, and I invited you on the stage and said, do you mind if I shoot you? If you know for sure that I can bring you back to life, why not? I mean, that's a great story, isn't it? The next time someone's, boasting about the new house they bought, you can say, yeah, I was resurrected last week. I mean, that's even better, isn't it? So what's the problem? Now, the reason why this is a really good question is because it's connected directly into what we're talking about, and I don't know if you've made that connection. The simple truth is, well, let me ask you, why do we sin? When we sin, why do we do it? Let's not pretend that we don't do it. Why? When we sin, what do we think will happen to us? What will it give us? Pleasure, joy, right? Okay, nobody sins thinking this is going to really hurt and make me miserable. Okay, when we sin, we think, I'm going to enjoy this. And when we think about holiness, the way it works is this. Some visiting speaker comes to your church, gets you all excited, and you say, God, from now on I'm going to live only for you. And you do it for about 2 weeks, and after 2 weeks you realize it's very hard. And you're like, gosh, this whole holiness thing is pretty difficult. And then you sort of say to God, God, look, I deserve just a little bit of sin in my life right now. Okay, for the last 2 weeks I've been doing everything for you and only about you, and I'm just going to take this little bit of sin for me. It's like being on a diet, and then you think, what, I've been on the diet for 2 weeks, just a few squares of chocolate, it won't hurt anybody. Now, what this reveals is we think about sin in an insufficiently serious way. We equate sin with pleasure. We assume when we're doing the things that we shouldn't do, it will make us happier. But Jesus knew the truth. There's a phrase in English, we don't use it a lot anymore, it's a shame. The phrase is, as miserable as sin. It basically means to be utterly depressed. And it's not an accident of language. Let me ask you another question. And forgive me if this is too blunt. Let's suppose you're thinking of committing some kind of sexual sin. Before you commit it, you live in the excitement of it. Then you have the moment of it. Shortly after that, what's the next feeling you have? How do you feel? Even better? Or worse? You see, the way sin entices us is it promises something that it can't deliver. And actually, the long-term effect of it is it not just simply leads to disappointment, it even less leads to death and imprisonment. So here's the trouble. When we think of experiencing sin, we think pleasure. When Jesus thought about experiencing sin, he thinks death. This kills everything. So now let's come to the cross. Because the real pain of the cross isn't the physicality of it. Does that make sense? It's not the physical pain he's about to go through. When Jesus Christ goes to the cross, he becomes sin for us. He becomes a curse for us. He takes our sin into himself. And as Jesus Christ takes the sin of the world into himself, what does he pray? Oh boy, this feels really good. I wish I'd indulged myself a little bit earlier. What does he pray? Why have you forsaken me? And Jesus Christ now experiences the single most painful thing you can possibly know in this world. So painful to take sin into his life, he's even praying, Father, if it is possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. We have to totally rethink the way we think about sin. And that's the price that Jesus Christ is ultimately paying on the cross. That's the thing that most terrifies him. And that's the price he's willing to pay, because you're right. He knows he's going to, freely I lay my life down, I'll pick it up again. But there's something even bigger going on. The way sin entraps all of us is, it's promising something it can't deliver. It looks good from the outside, it kills you from the inside. And that's what Jesus was willing to do. That's what, when we talk about his death on the cross, that's what we're talking about. It's the most amazing thing. The way to find a way to pursue God isn't to make yourself feel guilty. That's not going to work. Okay, look, the way it tends to work is, God, I'll live for you, you're amazing. I'm feeling very tempted, I don't think I can say no. I think I deserve this because something bad's happened in my life, so I sin. Then all of a sudden you have the remorse, I feel terrible. And it feels so terrible, you say to yourself, God, I'll never ever do this again. Okay? And then you're back to where you started. But then you start feeling tempted again. Okay? Then you think, I can't stop myself. Okay? Then you actually do what you're not meant to do. Then you feel so guilty, you think, I'll never ever do that again. And then you come back to where you are. Any of you familiar with this washing cycle? The trouble is, eventually it becomes meaningless. Does that make sense? You go round so many times, you think, forget it, nothing's changing. It will kill you. There is a way to see that cycle broken with Christ. I don't have time to unpack all of it now, but that's the reason why your question, it ties in so beautifully what we're talking earlier. It's the depth to which God was willing to go to rescue us, and we have to realize what we're messing with. Does that partly answer your question? It's a very profound question. You said you had two. No? By the way, if you prefer to write your question down, if you have a $100 bill, write your question on the pass it up to the front, and I'll read it.
I think you've covered, the second question is more or less covered by your answer, but the second question I had initially was, if God was humane, he was kind, he was merciful, couldn't he think of a more humane way?
Yeah, to rescue us?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you all hear the question? Okay, if God is all loving and kind, why the cross? Why not some other way? And I love this question. It's very, very, very profound. Have you ever read the book, The Cross of Christ by John Stott? Have any of you here read that book? I tell you what, if you haven't read The Cross of Christ by John Stott, put up your hand, don't be ashamed. If you've never read it, shame on you. Look, there are only a few books I've read multiple times. The Cross of Christ I've read maybe, I don't know how many times I've read it. It's one of the most profound books you could possibly read. And it asks, again, that question. Isn't there a better way? Let me just say this. Jesus Christ came willingly into this world. He knew what was before him. He was willing to pay it. Even though he was willing, he's praying, Lord, if there's some other way, but, that tells you something. That tells you something that it was willing, but it wasn't easy. And if there was another way, I'm sure he would have taken it. And it comes back to how serious we think sin is. Again, we think sin is a minor problem. It's not a minor problem. It kills us. We were all created in the image of God. We were made does that make sense? In his image. That means when we sin, we don't just simply sin against God, we also sin against our own highest welfare. We damage and destroy ourselves. Sin isn't just a simple thing which needs to be forgiven. It brings death into this world that needs to be reversed. And Christ's cross and resurrection speaks straight to that. I'd unpack it even more for you, but look, buy that book. I'm not on commission. Okay? Uncle John's now gone to be with the Lord, but you should read his book. Oh boy, now the professionals are coming out to ask me questions. They didn't say it was going to be that hard.
Hey Michael, thank you so much for an amazing talk. I love the way that you looked at that play on words in the Greek, aphrone, euphrain, and I enjoyed following it myself. And I love the way that you've just commended to everyone doing some reading. Yeah, I think everyone needs to do some more reading, and I'm so encouraged by how many questions and how many people are here. And yet you said you'd had that experience, and I've had it myself, of asking a bunch of people studying theology what happiness is and no one knowing, and it reminded me of the quote by the great Karl Barth, "He who has no joy is no theologian." Yeah. And you've got that joy, and I see it, and you're a theologian, and I just wonder how you would encourage this group of people here to do that hard work of theology that brings joy, of going deeper, of finding that truth.
You know, someone once said, the trouble with a lot of theologians is they go down deeper, stay down longer, and come up murkier than anybody else. And there's a sad reality in that. But let me put it in a slightly different way, which hopefully, the trouble with all forms of study and relationship is they take commitment. And that's true for love as well. I remember before I got married, I heard my father-in-law preaching. He was a great preacher, Anne's father. And he gave the illustration, and he said, "I love my wife more now than I did when I first got married." And I remember listening to that as a young man thinking, what a load of rubbish. And I can also remember thinking, there must be something wrong with you. Because the feeling I have for Anne now is so intense, so powerful. You know, this burning longing I have to be with her is so all-encompassing. There can't be anything bigger than that. So there's clearly something wrong with you. You married someone and you weren't that excited about it, and then slowly over the years you've slowly warmed up, and you're closing in on where I am. You know, what's the matter with you? Well, I say I'll be celebrating my 25th wedding anniversary this year. My wife, I'm trying to currently plan what to do with her to mark the occasion. And I can tell you now, I love her more now than I possibly could have known 25 years ago. Because the commitment takes you deeper. And that's true about everything. If you fall in love with God and you take that commitment seriously, so you want to learn and study and appreciate them more, you fall more in love with them, not less. It fuels your passion. If you get married to someone, you spend more time, you talk to them, you learn about them, you find out about them, you understand them, how you work together, your love grows. That's why so many human hearts are empty. There's an absence of commitment, which means that they never enter into the depth of that reality. So we have to rediscover the joy of that kind of commitment. And I'll just give one other example. A couple of years ago, I was in London, and I was in a department store, and I got talking to this guy who was buying something in front of me, and I could tell he was American. And so I just said, "Oh, where in America are you from?" He said, "I'm from LA." And I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm here on holiday with my wife." And I said, "Oh, where is she?" And he said, "Oh, she loves the theater. But I hate the theater," he said. "So she's watching some matinee, and when it's finished, we're going to go out for dinner." And I said, "Well, actually, bizarrely, I'm waiting for my wife to come down to London. I'm going to be speaking, actually, I was speaking at HTBB the next morning in London, and my wife and kids were coming down, were staying in a hotel that night to go first thing in the morning to the church." So I said, so I then got talking to him, and I just said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I used to run the LAPD, okay, the police department in LA." And I said, "I know exactly what you do because I've watched all the movies." And he responded like you responded. He started laughing, and we sat down and started talking. And a few hours earlier, I'd been having lunch with a general. And I said to this general in the army, I said, "You know, when I was 15, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Now, God changed it, but I wanted to be a lawyer. And I was working hard, and I was committed to achieving it. I said, forget about being 25. I now meet 35-year-olds, and they're not committed to anything. They change their job every 2 years. They're drifting through life. How do you breed leadership in the absence of commitment?" And the general sat back in his chair and he said, "This is the number one problem we have in the army." He said, "I was in charge of officer selection and training for all armed services, all the different branches of the armed services for the UK, and this was our number one problem. We have a real problem finding officers today." And so I told the story to this guy that I just met, and I said to him, "How would you answer that question?" I asked him the same question: how do you breed leadership in the absence of commitment? And he smiled at me and he said, "Well, for the last 5 years of my life, I was in charge of officer training for the LAPD." He says, and this was our number one problem. He said, we flew in motivational speakers, we flew in experts, we flew in all kinds of people to try and reverse that, and we couldn't do it. He says, when I left and retired, the problem we had is people didn't respect the eldership, the leadership above them, because there was no commitment there. Look, in the absence of real commitment, you're going to miss out on so much. Leadership, capacity, relationship, understanding. And when you're committed and you put yourself through that, you don't end up less excited, you end up more. That's the most, and it thrills you. And it's the most amazing thing to see. And so, I would commend to you, I don't know how the Bible school program here works. Is it available to anyone or have they be pursuing ordination? Everybody. Look, the more you study this, the more amazing it is. If this is God's word, the most amazing things are in here. I probably need to wrap up the formal part of this. Let me give one final story, which is true. I have a great privilege of working with a guy called Professor John Lennox in Oxford. And he's a very cuddly man. When he speaks, he's so warm and gentle, you want to go up and just give him a hug, because he's just so friendly. And at the university in Oxford, there's a program run through the Said Business School for world leaders. And I can't remember if it's £50,000 or £80,000 for 5 weeks. But either way, it's a lot of money. So it's largely attended by military dictators, former heads of various countries, and so on. And John was invited to go and do something with them. And so what he said to them was, he said, "I'm going to give you just one lecture, and what I'm going to do is we're going to look at an ancient piece of literature, and we're going to learn together what does it teach about leadership." And he opened the book of Daniel from the Bible, and he got them to read it. Now, when you're charging, let's say, £80,000 for a 5-week course, you get feedback on every lecture. So every student was asked to give their feedback on every single aspect of the course. For 3 or 4 years in a row, the single highest rated added value component of that entire program was the Bible study that John Lennox would lead with them out of the book of Daniel. And there weren't any Christians in that room. There are some amazing things in here. When you study it and you plumb its depths, you should be able to take some of the greatest leaders in the world, put them in the room, say, this is what is taught in here, and have all of them go, wow. Some of you, God might even be calling to appear before kings, prime ministers, and rulers. The question is, if he ever gave you that opportunity, what would you say to them? And it's found in here. So if you haven't thought about doing that Bible school, or going deeper, let me encourage you. The most profound insight you could bring into the boardroom, into the political sphere, to society at large, or even your family, is in here. Take the time to go deep in here. You will never, ever regret it. You've listened very well. You all deserve a cookie. Thank you for having me. Well, look,